For 8 hours, the night did not move. Cold pressed into the mountains, radios whispered. Shadows stretched across frozen ground. And somewhere in the dark, Canadian soldiers waited, silent, disciplined, unseen. Across the valley, Chinese command posts listened. They heard sounds that didn't make sense, signals that shouldn't exist, movement where there should have been none. Orders were given, then questioned. Confidence began to crack, because this was not a normal confrontation. This was pressure, precision, patience. And by the time morning came, Chinese generals would make a decision they would never reverse again. Stay with us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you're watching from, because this story changes how history remembers silence. The Korean Peninsula, early 1950s. Winter ruled everything. The mountains were jagged, unforgiving, cutting the land into narrow corridors where movement was slow and sound traveled far. Snow packed itself into boots. Breath turned solid in the air. Metal burned bare skin. For Canadian forces stationed along a critical ridgeline, this terrain was both a threat and an advantage. They had learned it. Every rise, every depression, every place sound echoed. And every place it died. This was not their first night under pressure. But this night felt different. Chinese forces had been probing for days. Not attacking outright, testing. Listening, watching patterns. Commanders on both sides understood the unspoken truth of winter warfare. Whoever lost patience first, lost everything. The Canadians did not rush. They prepared quietly. No dramatic speeches. No visible movement. Just adjustments. Positions refined. Communications checked. Contingency plans rehearsed in whispers. The strategy wasn't built on overwhelming force. It was built on uncertainty. Canadian patrols moved in staggered intervals, never on a fixed schedule. Signals were deliberately irregular. Silence stretched long, then broke briefly, then returned. From a distance it looked chaotic. From inside the system it was controlled precision. Chinese commanders, monitoring the situation, began to notice something unsettling. There was no clear pattern. Normally, even the most disciplined units reveal habits under stress. Timings repeat, responses become predictable. But here, nothing repeated. Reports from forward observers conflicted. One unit reported movement to the west. Another swore it came from higher ground. A third claimed the sounds were closer than before, but couldn't confirm. Radios crackled with partial information. No one had a full picture. And that was the point. The Canadians were not trying to dominate the battlefield physically. They were shaping perception. Psychological pressure was applied not through aggression, but through presence. Constant, controlled, impossible to pin down. 8 hours passed like this. Not a single moment of full clarity. Chinese command posts cycled through options. Advance, hold, withdraw slightly and reassess. Each option carried risk, because the enemy they were facing refused to reveal himself. Every order issued came back with questions. Every answer created new doubts. This was not fear. It was something worse for a commander: uncertainty. By the 4th hour, fatigue set in. Not physical exhaustion, but mental strain. Decision-makers were forced to stay alert without resolution. No closure, no confirmation. The Canadians remained disciplined. No unnecessary action, no dramatic escalation. They understood something critical. The longer uncertainty lasted, the more expensive every possible move became for the opposing command. This was a lesson learned from earlier conflicts. Sometimes the most powerful move is restraint. As dawn approached, reports slowed, not because the situation was clearer, but because commanders were no longer confident in what they were hearing. Silence returned, and in that silence, a realization began to form inside Chinese leadership. This was not a force they could easily predict, not one they could pressure into mistakes, not one that reacted emotionally. The 8-hour standoff ended without a decisive clash, but it left something behind: a memory, a warning, a recalculation that would echo long after the snow melted, and that recalculation would shape every decision that followed. Dawn arrived slowly. The sky over the ridge was pale, washed in gray. Snow clung stubbornly to the mountains. Every tree, every rock, every trace of movement from the night before was frozen in silence. The Canadian soldiers stood in their positions, checking equipment, eyes scanning the distant horizon. Calm alert, unbroken. Across the valley, Chinese command units were quiet. Not silent in a peaceful sense, but in the hollow, tense quiet of commanders realizing they had been misjudged. Reports trickled in from patrols and forward observers, each contradicting the next. The geography, the weather, and the Canadians' subtle maneuvers had created a puzzle no one could fully solve. Major Richard Haywood, the Canadian officer in charge of the ridge, walked along the line. His boots made soft impressions in the snow. He did not speak loudly. A nod, a glance, a hand gesture sufficed. Discipline moved like a wave through the soldiers. Precise, efficient, unassuming. The previous night's operation had not required direct confrontation. There were no charges across open snowfields, no artillery barrages, no dramatic explosions, only positioning, timing, controlled sound, and relentless unpredictability. This approach unnerved the Chinese commanders. Lieutenant General Zhao looked at his maps repeatedly. The same calculations over and over. Every possible attack route had been watched, every approach expected. But the enemy's movements were never consistent. It was as if the Canadians had vanished into the terrain itself. "Where are they?" Zhao asked quietly, almost to himself. "How are they everywhere and nowhere?" His staff exchanged nervous glances. Confidence, built over months of coordinated maneuvers, was fraying. Every minor discrepancy, every unconfirmed report, created a tension that no artillery barrage could fix. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side, soldiers moved with careful intention. Snipers adjusted positions. Forward observers signaled with subtle hand movements. Supply lines were checked. Nothing extravagant, nothing unnecessary. But every action reinforced an invisible message. We are ready, we are patient, and we are everywhere you cannot see. 8 hours of this had done what thousands of direct attacks often could not. It had imposed mental strain without a single casualty. Chinese patrols reported shadows where there were none, footsteps in places where the Canadians had never been, echoes that did not correspond to reality. Orders were repeated multiple times, then questioned again. Frustration built. By late morning, Zhao and his fellow generals convened. Papers shuffled, radios crackled with half-formed reports. Arguments began. "Hold position," one said. "They cannot be here in force." "They are everywhere," another countered. "We do not know their strength." The debate continued. Every recommendation was met with doubt. Every command considered risky. The mental exhaustion of the night had turned their precision into hesitation. Meanwhile, Canadian soldiers, unaware of the confusion they had sown, continued routine checks. They ate, they cleaned, they observed. The tension they had created had already done its work. Some Chinese units attempted minor probing maneuvers, only to find empty snowfields, false signals, footprints that led nowhere. By midday, command confidence was broken. The generals could not commit, they could not attack. This was the quiet victory. A victory not recorded in the destruction of enemy forces, but in the restraint, patience, and control that shaped perception. Back on the ridge, Haywood walked with a subtle smile. He knew his team had done more than hold a position. They had redefined the battlefield in the minds of the enemy. A single night, 8 hours, and no one would ever look at this ridge in the same way again. The Chinese generals returned to their headquarters with cautious calculations. The Canadians had not fired a single shot in desperation. They had not taken unnecessary risks. Yet they had imposed an invisible control. A mental map, invisible to their adversaries, had been drawn in their minds. And that invisible map would last. Even weeks later, commanders would refer back to that ridge, to that night. They would remember the cold, the sound, the silence, and how one small, disciplined force could make a larger army hesitate, doubt, and ultimately respect them. Because sometimes the loudest battles are fought in silence. Because sometimes the strongest victories are won before the first bullet is fired. By mid-afternoon, the ridge had become a theater of shadows. Canadian soldiers had mastered the art of illusion. They used snowdrifts, brush, and terrain to make themselves appear in multiple places at once. Flashes of movement here, a rifle glinting there, enough to unsettle even seasoned observers. Every gesture was deliberate, every footprint calculated to mislead. Sergeant James Callahan crouched behind a rock outcrop, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He spotted a Chinese patrol moving cautiously through a valley below. They hesitated, uncertain. Callahan adjusted the reflective surface of a small mirror. A ray of sunlight hit the snow at just the right angle, creating the illusion of another soldier, a phantom in the cold white expanse. "Move as we planned," he whispered. "Every step, every sound, it's part of the story." The generals across the way relied on reports, each one increasingly fragmented. Some said Canadians were in force. Others said the ridge was empty. Every conflicting message added to their anxiety. The mental pressure mounted like the snow piling on the hillsides. Meanwhile, Captain Robert Hayes signaled quietly to a pair of snipers. They shifted position without a sound. From their new vantage, they watched enemy scouts search fruitlessly for signs of life. Every twitch of a rifle, every slight motion, was exaggerated by the terrain to appear larger, stronger, more threatening than it actually was. The beauty of the operation was in its simplicity. No needless engagements, no wasted ammunition, no exposure, just the careful orchestration of perception. Back in the Chinese command post, Lieutenant General Zhao's confidence faltered further. Reports contradicted each other so thoroughly that he questioned his own calculations. Are they here? Are they attacking? His voice was tight, controlled, but stress edged every word. He called for reinforcements, but no one moved decisively. Each unit was hesitant, unsure, waiting for confirmation that never came. The Canadian officers smiled quietly. They knew there was trapped in hesitation. 8 hours of methodical, patient maneuvering had created an invisible stranglehold on decision-making. The larger force could not commit without certainty, and certainty was impossible. On the ridge, Private Liam O'Connor adjusted a small sound amplifier hidden in the snow. A soft echo carried down the valley, making it seem as if more soldiers were moving, repositioning, taking up new positions. Footsteps, muffled shouts, the shuffle of gear, everything was simulated. Every illusion reinforced by silence and snow. And then came the subtle brilliance of timing. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the valley, the Canadians withdrew slightly, but carefully, deliberately. A false retreat. Footprints led to empty spaces. Equipment left behind in strategic locations suggested a larger force than was truly present. Chinese scouts followed these traces, convinced they had an opportunity. Every step they took led them deeper into the illusion. Exhaustion set in, decision slowed, hesitation grew heavier. By evening, the generals were paralyzed. They could not discern fact from fiction. Every plan was tentative, every order second-guessed. The Canadian force, smaller and disciplined, had effectively seized control of their minds. Major Haywood stood at the ridge's edge, binoculars lowered. "They're questioning everything," he said. "Every report, every calculation. They'll wait until morning, and even then, they won't trust what they see." It was true. The larger army had faced a masterclass in psychological warfare. 8 hours of quiet, precise, relentless maneuvering had rewritten the battlefield. The Canadians had not needed a single large-scale clash. They had not risked unnecessary exposure. They had forced an entire army to confront uncertainty, and uncertainty was its own weapon. As night fell, the ridge fell silent. Not the quiet of fear, the quiet of control achieved without bloodshed. Every soldier understood the lesson of the day. Discipline, patience, and intelligence could bend perception, change outcomes, and win battles before the first engagement. And somewhere across the valley, Chinese generals would never forget it. The 8-hour illusion would echo in strategy discussions for months. For years, officers would reference the ridge. They would speak of snow, shadows, and silence. They would remember how a smaller, methodical force could force hesitation in the mighty, simply by controlling what could and could not be seen. Because war isn't always measured in casualties. It's measured in the control of minds, the shaping of decisions, and the mastery of perception. Night descended over the ridge with a silence so complete it felt alive. The cold bit had exposed skin. Yet the Canadian soldiers remained alert, crouched beneath camouflaged nets, listening to the valley below. The faint crack of ice shifting or the whisper of wind over snow could be mistaken for movement. And they used that uncertainty to their advantage. Lieutenant Michael Fraser adjusted his scope, scanning the dim outlines of distant figures. Chinese units were scattered, hesitant. Every patrol moved slowly, carefully, almost suspiciously, as though expecting the invisible hand of a phantom army to strike at any moment. Their hesitation was a gift, earned through hours of discipline and deception. Captain Hayes gathered his officers quietly. "Remember," he said in a low voice, "we're not here to fight tonight. We're here to watch, learn, and maintain the advantage. Every shadow counts, every sound counts. The longer they wait, the stronger our position becomes." Meanwhile, across the valley, General Zhao sat in his command tent, flicking through reports with growing frustration. Messengers arrived with fragments of information, contradicting each other. Reports claimed Canadian positions that did not exist. Other reports mentioned phantom artillery. Zhao rubbed his temple, aware his larger army was immobilized not by bullets, but by uncertainty. Back on the ridge, Sergeant Callahan marked footprints leading toward an empty slope. He whispered to Private O'Connor, "They'll follow this trail first thing in the morning. Watch how it shapes their thinking." Every movement, every deliberate trace of activity, was a lesson in psychological dominance. Hours passed. Soldiers huddled around small stoves, drinking steaming tea, conserving warmth while keeping their ears open. They could hear the faint crunch of snow far below, the soft murmur of voices, and the occasional thump of boots hitting the icy ground. Each sound was a tool, a subtle reminder to the enemy that they were never truly alone, never completely certain. In the darkness, Captain Hayes reflected on how small units could bend strategy. The 8-hour operation had proven that intelligence, patience, and the control of perception could outperform sheer numbers. History might remember the day as a minor skirmish, Yet for those who had orchestrated it, it was a masterclass in tactical brilliance. At one point, a young scout returned from the far edge of the ridge. "Sir, they're sending reconnaissance further down," he whispered. Hayes nodded. Every move of the enemy reinforced their plan. The Canadians had built a web of uncertainty. The Chinese generals had walked straight into it, unaware that hesitation was now their invisible captor. Elise Carter, observing from a concealed position, wrote notes on every subtle reaction of the opposing forces. The glances between officers, the pauses before issuing orders, the conflicting reports, all of it catalogued. Even history itself would learn from this moment, she thought. War was more than weapons. It was timing, psychology, and the discipline to wait until the right moment. As the night grew colder, the ridge seemed to shimmer under the pale moonlight. Shadows danced across snowdrifts, and the sound of distant boots carried further than anyone expected. To anyone unaware of the Canadian positions, the ridge seemed occupied by a far larger force than reality dictated. The soldiers remained silent, careful. They shared no laughter, no idle conversation. Each understood that every footstep, every breath, every small movement could either preserve the advantage or give it away. They were ghosts in white, invisible yet omnipresent. By the end of the night, the Chinese forces had retreated slightly, unwilling to commit to action in the darkness. Exhaustion weighed heavily on both sides, yet only the disciplined Canadians held the real control. They had achieved a psychological victory without a shot fired. Captain Hayes looked across the valley, satisfied. Tomorrow, they'll face daylight uncertainty. They'll doubt every report, every order. That's when we hold the upper hand, and they'll remember the ridge forever. The soldiers settled in for a long, quiet night. Some wrote letters home, others simply stared into the vast, icy expanse below. All knew they had participated in something that would echo in military training for years to come. An 8-hour operation that bent perception, rewrote strategy, and showed how even the largest armies could hesitate when faced with disciplined precision. The ridge remained silent under the moonlight, but in that silence lay victory. A quiet, unseen triumph that would haunt the enemy for years.